Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland, and behind me is Reading Abbey Gateway, perhaps the only extant building from Reading Abbey, which was founded by King Henry I in 1121. So an abbey is a large monastery, or convent, in this case it's monastery. So monks were living here, those are religious men. So England's still a Christian country, but back then it was a Catholic country, mostly not an Anglican country as it is today. So Catholicism was the only type of Christianity allowed. Anyway, so it was in 1164 that it was officially opened, well over 100 years after it was founded, and Henry II came here because he'd restored order after this civil war called the 19 Long Winters. So it was very significant, and it turned Reading into quite a large town. We're very close to the River Thames, and the River Kennet flows in here, which is a tributary to the Thames, and so that's partly why in 1254 the town received its charter, as in a document conferring rights which entitled a town to build a town wall. Now that was important because if you rebelled against the king and you had a town wall, it would be much more difficult for his soldiers to storm the town, and indeed the right to hold markets on certain days. The townsfolk were then freed from unpaid menial service like la corvée, building and repairing roads, or indeed feudal service, having to work unpaid on the fields of a local landlord, having to, say, mill your corn only in his mills, for which he charged you over the odds, things like that. So they were no longer serfs. Serfs were semi-slaves, and of course the majority of the population were serfs into the 1560s. So Parliament even met here in 1453. Parliament didn't always meet in London. It was wherever the king chose for them to meet, or didn't always meet in Westminster, to be more accurate, because of course Westminster was a separate city to London, at least theoretically, until 1889. So the monks here, they were obviously praying at least 5 times a day, getting up very early for matins and various holy offices. An office just meant actually a prayer ceremony, not an office as we would use the word today. So the monks, they live together, they're known as brothers, they call each other brother. Often you take a new name. If I became a monk, I'd be brother whoever. Let's say I choose the name Anastasius, and I wouldn't use my baptismal name, your name and religion. You can stick with your baptismal name, but they rarely do. Take vows of poverty, chastity and obedience. So not to own any personality, just to share things. You might have a few personal effects, your clothes, that's about it. To share books and everything else. And then do charitable work, teaching people, visiting the sick, being a doctor, visiting people in prison, helping the homeless, whatever, the mentally ill, anything like that, looking after wayfarers, particularly pilgrims on the way to Canterbury, for example, to pray at the tomb of Thomas Becket, or on the way to Jerusalem, wherever it was, copying things out in the scriptorium, the writing room, and so forth, having chapters of the Bible read to you whilst you eat, long periods of fasting in Lent, having maybe just one small meal in Lent, all sorts of things. So a lot of mortification of the flesh. There are many different orders of monks, and they wear different colours of robe according to the order of the monks. And then sometimes a guy can be a monk and a priest, and if he's a priest as well, it's called father whoever, because only a priest can officiate at certain ceremonies, such as saying mass. So different orders have got different functions. Do they focus more on charity, or just more on prayer, or more on education, or what? Some are very enclosed, don't interact with the laity. Others are not, and they interact with the laity a great deal. Some believe in having long periods of silence in the day. Often they wake up and the very first words they speak have to be prayers, and so on. Often their meals, as I say, are in silence, hearing the Bible read to them. So those were these monks here, but some of them were very badly behaved. So in 1539, Henry VIII decided on the dissolution of the monasteries. Well, sorry, I've been doing that since a bit earlier, about 1534, sending out commissioners to monasteries and convents, God, it's so noisy, around the country to collect reports, what's been going on, trying to find disgraceful behavior from these monks and nuns, and say you're breaking your vows of chastity or whatever it is, so your religious house is going to be dissolved. They can be called chantries, or various things like that. An abbey is a big one, and it can have priories or offshoots. So the priory could be 10 miles away, could be 100 miles away. I knew an abbey in Yorkshire, and I had a priory in Zimbabwe. So the abbot is in charge of the abbey, and the prior is in charge of the priory. Now the priory gets big enough, they might decide we don't want to be connected to the abbey anymore, we're going to become an abbey of our own, and sever our links with them. So different orders of monks, like Benedictines, or Franciscans, whatever, all sorts of white friars, grey friars, black friars, and so forth. Anything else about this? So education was often part of it, and education and religion were almost the same thing. And when people were reading, they were often just mainly finding out how to read the Bible. So it's right in the centre of Reading. They were very near the river, partly because they could catch fish. Because remember, Catholics, we weren't allowed to eat meat on a Friday till the 1960s. That's the Second Vatican Council. So a good alternative to meat would be either fish or else eggs. Well, you notice in school quite often fish and eggs are served on a Friday, so you can get your protein. You never have to eat fish as a Catholic, or eggs, but if you're not going to eat meat, you might well choose to do that. Although it's no longer a rule of Catholicism, some people choose to abide by it, except in England and Wales. When there was that papal visit in 2010, it was brought back. So it's a sin to eat meat on a Friday in England and Wales, but not the rest of the world. How illogical is that? Anyway, so Henry VIII closed it down in 1539. He'd had commissioners collect bad stories of iniquitous conduct from all these religious houses, a convent if it's for nuns, which could be alcoholism, gross feeding, fornication, swearing, or some of them were absolute charlatans, just gulling people, exploiting the naivete of the laity and pretending that they had angels there and demanding loads of money, not living at the monastery, just ripping it off. But some of the reports were actually quite positive. Said, no, these people are actually very morally upright and they are attending their religious duties, they're pious. They didn't like that, so Henry VIII often ordered these reports to be sent back and rewritten. Thomas Cromwell was his Lord Chancellor at the time, was in charge of this project. Thomas Cromwell, the granduncle of Oliver Cromwell. So anyway, they closed the smaller and more disreputable ones first of all. Then the second wave, they closed virtually all of them. Bizarrely, they actually left a couple of them open. So often they're torn down. And these places, they were a centre of charity and education, and therefore there was a lacuna in society. And often there's a centre of a community who were often proud of the local monastery, and there weren't very many schools that weren't connected to them. He almost shut Eton on the basis that it looked like a monastery, because the only educated people really were the clergy, apart from a handful of aristocrats. Those who went to university, the great majority of them became clergy, or religious to be more accurate if you're a monk. So almost every learned person you ever heard of until the 18th century was a priest or monk, or indeed nun. So for women, that was almost the only way to get any kind of an advanced education, because almost all universities were completely closed to women at the time. There was one Italian woman in the 15th century who was so extraordinary in her intellectual capability that a university said, we're just going to have to admit her, even though it really goes against the grain because we say women are intellectually inferior. So that's a little bit about Reading Abbey. And then because this was a larger and more reputable one, they were loath to close it, but finally in 1539 they decided they would. So Hugh Cook, who's from Farringdon in Oxfordshire, was the abbot here, and he spoke out against that, saying the king didn't have the right to do that. He'd broken with Rome in 1533, Henry VIII, because he wasn't getting an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his mistress, and Boleyn was already gravid by him. So he said, I'm the head of the church, no more Catholic church here, it's the Church of England. But so he's only introducing it step by step, Anglicanism as we know it. Yes, the king was head of the church, but apart from that, everything stayed the same at first. And then the Church of England moved in a more Protestant direction. Towards the end of her reign, it moved back a little bit. Yes, the king was still the head of the church, he wasn't going to have the Pope in charge, but some of these ceremonies and doctrines were going to become a bit more Catholic towards the end. Anyway, so the king wouldn't tolerate the least dissent, so Hugh Cook was hanged, drawn and quartered as he's executed in the most agonizing manner. There's this barbaric public ritual where he was lightly hanged, not to kill him, just strangled for a minute or two, so still alive, still conscious, and then dragged backwards through the streets behind a horse, because his crimes have been retrograde to nature in questioning the authority of his sovereign lord the king. So that would also be agonizing, to be bumping along the rough stones and almost skinned alive. And then have his limbs hacked off, last of all his privities, his entrails unplucked and burnt before his eyes. By this time he presumably passed out from blood loss, and finally his head smitten from his body, and his 4 members dispatched to the 4 corners of the realm to be placed on pikes in the public square as a healthy warning lest anyone transgress the king's majesty. This is the fate that awaits you, gruesome as it is. So That wasn't done in Great Britain until the 1790s. In Ireland, 1803, Robert Emmet was the last one to suffer this appalling fate. So 1539, it was closed down. Anyway, what else after this? It was people still lived in it. Often these things were sold off to the aristocracy because Henry VIII fought 3 long, disastrous, unwinnable wars against France. And so the Catholic Church owned a third of the land in the early 16th century. Remember that the farmland was the main economic resource. We didn't even mine coal that much in those days. It's before the Industrial Revolution. The population was only about 3.5 million. So producing food, that's our most basic need. If you own farmland, then you're wealthy, because people often donated land to the church. The church is a very, very wealthy institution. So he got it. Sometimes he's renting it out, sometimes he's selling it off to the aristocracy. Anyway, a huge church had been built here, over 100 meters long. That's just the gateway which separated it from the town. We're in what would have been the Abbey now. I'm not sure there's been gardens or buildings. And after the Abbey was seized by the king, he turned the bit of the gateway into the palace. But we'll see where the older part of it was, and it was gigantic. There's obviously quite fertile farmland. So people donated land to the church because they thought, well, then that'll buy me a place in the New Jerusalem. I'll pass through purgatory. You might know this Catholic doctrine that you'll go through this purgatorial punishment to purify you by pain. And once you've expiated your iniquity, after a few centuries of punishment, then you might be fit to enter the pearly gates that Peter will let you into heaven. What else should I point out about this? Yeah, Reading Prison is hard by, and here's a Catholic church, this one, a 19th century one. Look at the sort of flint that's on it. It's the sort of local stone you find here. So Catholicism, we triumphed in the end, hurrah! Okay, the Church of England is still here, but Catholicism was allowed back eventually. So it fell into rack and ruin. A lot of the houses here, presumably, we can't see at the foundations, they will have plundered stone from when it fell down. And Sir George Gilbert Scott in the late 19th century, he helped to rebuild Reading Abbey because it was the gateway and more around it, the houses near it that housed the school of Reading Abbey School that Jane Austen went to, a girls-only school, because girls and boys in the better sort of school were usually separated well into the 20th century, but most schools are mixed now. So I mean, I would guess some of these stones probably come from the original Reading Abbey. We don't concentrate on the gateway too much. And so we're into the ruins of it. They often took the roof off it, as in so the monks couldn't come back. But as being such a town, people would notice. In rural Yorkshire, I've often seen the roof stripped off because it's sort of the middle of nowhere. So the king wouldn't maybe not notice that well, didn't have such strong control. Here we go. This is where Reading Abbey is. You get some sort of idea of the scale of the place. Hundreds of monks would have lived here. So anyway. And then a king indeed is buried in there, but I might talk about him. All right, pier of the presbytery. Well, presbytery is often where the priests live. I mean, as I say, you can be both a monk and a priest at the same time. It's a bit like being both a doctor and a dentist at the same time. You see over there, that's Oscar's Diner. That's the defunct Reading jail, where Oscar Wilde cooled his heels for a couple of years, having been found guilty of same-sex relations. So enormous. You just imagine the little hovels that most people inhabited at the time. Be about the standard of a garden shed. So not very warm. No wonder they're getting pneumonia all the time. And well, what a waste of a huge building. And I don't think they repurposed it, but I'm not quite sure. So Henry VIII, because of these very expensive wars against France, he was told not to fight by his wiser older councillors. He'd more or less bankrupted the country, had imposed an amicable grant, which was anything but amicable, which is a forced loan, and taxing people to an early grave. So he was an absolutely monstrous tyrant. So people sometimes think that in England this idea of parliamentary government goes back for centuries. It doesn't. I talked about Parliament meeting here because, well, up until Charles I, the Civil War, the Parliament met at the monarch's pleasure. When he or she chose to summon Parliament, it met. If she chose not to summon it, then it would not meet. For years, up to 10 years, it would summon it to discuss some issue, to vote new taxes, which is sort of by passive assent. If you don't actually disagree, then we assume you agree. And in return, they say we want a new law on this, and we want to repeal that old law, and the king had to agree to that. So that's the way Parliament functioned at the time. It was only to advise the monarch, and as James I said, it's only if I solicit that advice. You mustn't offer this advice if I don't ask for it. Now, I was talking about had to be near a river. Well, here's the Kennet. And you see it's got these sort of artificial banks to stop it overflowing so that they could get their fish. You'll very often notice that former religious houses, convents, monasteries, priories, abbeys, they're very close to a river or a stream usually. Like in St Albans, it was close to Fishpool Street. So there really was a pond there that they could get their fish. Anyway, so it was known as Holy Brook, this bit of the Kennet. Anything else I should say? So there was obviously a big abbey church there where they worshipped. The monks slept in dormitories, so not to have many personal possessions. And anyway, so Henry I, he died in 1135, and his body was then embalmed and returned here to be buried here. He died in France because remember he ruled a lot of France. And it was over a month before he died. His body was taken by boat, so probably landed just here and buried on the 3rd of January 1136. So it was only properly really excavated in 1981, Reading Abbey, where they held a big Reading festival in the late 19th century, mostly in the ruins of the abbey, because this is the most historic thing about the town. So it's a sort of commuter town, but there are quite a few businesses around here, so quite a prosperous area, Reading, which is the largest town in Berkshire. So it's got over 200,000 people, very close to Heathrow Airport, a large railway station with excellent connections east-west. Anyway, so open to the public all the time. Anything else I should tell you about Reading Abbey? So this was a Benedictine abbey, as in based on the rules of St Benedict, who I think I'm right in saying lived in Egypt in the Dark Ages. Egypt being a mostly Christian country to the Islamic conquest of the 7th century, is now about 90% Muslim. So the lead roofs and so on, and the stones, they were plundered, sometimes sold, sometimes not just stolen, because no one was going to use it anymore. Sometimes sold off, sometimes people who didn't have a right to sell it just grabbed it anyway. So anyway, as I say, there was fighting here in the 1640s, a lot of fighting in the Thames Valley. London was parliamentarian, Oxford was royalist, Reading was halfway in between the two. So if you look closely, you'll see some of the damage to the stonework. So the monks had a large dormitory. It was like 11 meters wide, so they would have had dozens of beds in there. And the lavatory was the necessarium. Even in the late 18th century, we called the lavatory the necessary. And there was a calefactory, as in where they would have a fire to warm themselves up. They couldn't be too warm because that would be too pleasurable. You must suffer to pay off your sins. And the infirmary, which is like the hospital wing of the monastery. So you could enter here as a teenager, as a boy. Sometimes people had 10 children. They would give a tithe of their children to the church as a monk or a nun. Some people who'd been married if the spouse had died would sort of retire to the monastery or the convent, cramming for finals to think that they would hopefully be accepted into heaven when they finally died. But there was a guest dormitory for like pilgrims where they could stay overnight. And then if you look up there, you can see maybe some holes for the scaffolding, the wooden structure that would hold up some of the upper floors. Anyway, so in the Second World War, there are air raid shelters built in here to protect the townsfolk of Reading from the depredations of the Luftwaffe. That's the German Air Force. The Luft is the air bit, and the Waffe is the weapon bit. So perhaps you're getting some sort of idea of the dimensions of the place. And so the walls have stood pretty well. I mean, not bad considering they're built about 900 years ago. And they didn't have such modern technology. So it's had to be built to last. So you can see the local flint. What is that mortar holding it together? I'm no construction engineer, as you may have deduced. Anything else to say about Reading Abbey? I can't think of anything right now. So one of the largest religious houses around. There are a few Benedictine monasteries left in England. There's Ampleforth in North Yorkshire and the St Benedict's Abbey in London. They both had lots of terrible scandals in the past few years. So there was a cloister, which is sort of a courtyard they used to walk around, a refectory, which was their dining room, and various dignitaries came here. Heraclitus, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, in 1185, because remember it's only 1054 that the church split into the Orthodox Church in the east and the Catholic Church in the west, because the Pope said, I'm senior over all the 5 patriarchs, and the 4 Eastern patriarchs said, no, you're not, we're all on an equal footing, and hence the church split. Because prior to 1054, you can't talk about Catholic Church or Orthodox Church. There was the one Christian church throughout Christendom was united. Okay, they'd more or less lost contact with the Assyrian Church in India. Surprisingly, it's in India, it's called Assyrian. The Assyrian Church was not in Syria. And anyway, but when the Mohammedans clashed with the Christians in the Near East, the Orthodox Church pleaded with the Catholics in the name of Christian brotherhood to come and help them out. They did, but some of the Catholics from Western Europe regarded the Orthodox Christians as infidels just as bad as the Saracens. So were sacking Constantinople. We now call it Istanbul. Remember, Istanbul was a Christian city until 1453. There's that Hagia Sophia, which was a cathedral, then it became a mosque for centuries, then in the 1920s it became a museum, and after 100 years, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Egypt has made it a mosque once again, upsetting lots of people. Anything else? So yeah, in the 15th century, said Parliament met here. That's because there's an outbreak of bubonic plague in London. They thought it was a bit safer out here. There's a chapter house here where the monks met to have a chapter of the Bible read aloud to them each day. Not all monks were very literate. There was a room called the Cellarers Range where they kept all sorts of their food. The lavatorium, which is not lavatory, that's where you used to wash, probably in cold water. It was too expensive to heat it all up. I mentioned the scriptorium, not quite sure which one that was. So go into this building here. So gigantic, hey? And I don't wonder how many hundreds of monks lived here. So some of them would be very young. There wasn't a minimum age. I heard of a Benedictine, beginning as a Benedictine at the age of 18, not so many years ago. Summer is a coming in. I wonder if they wrote that here. Well, I'll read it to you, which is, well, that's it, a sort of a song to welcome the summer. Summer is a coming in. Okay. Oh, well, it doesn't give you the whole text of it. Because look at it is in English, but look at the script. It's very difficult to read. But is that Old English or Middle English? Because Old English is, say, 11th century and earlier. Middle English begins at the late 14th century. Geoffrey Chaucer is just about comprehensible. And then, well, on to Shakespeare. And then modern English is maybe something like from the 18th century onwards. You can understand almost everything they said in the 18th century, even though it seems odd. Oh, right. And another thing dedicated to the memory of Hugh de Eque's first abbot of Reading. I didn't know about him. He was Archbishop of Rouen later on. Rouen in France, because of course the church being an international organization, you could be translated from one country to another and given a high up office. Amor plebis tremor potentium claris avis claris studius recreator egentum. My Latin is so dreadful. The love of what? The ordinary people shakes power, something, the bird, and I can't get it, about study and recreation. Well, and look at the crozier being handed to him. The crozier is in the bishop's crook because he's to guide them. And look at this cow up there and the 3 shells, part of some coat of arms. I don't know who's got the 3 shells here. And I see another 3 shells up here. Oh, to the memory of Hugh Cook, who's the abbot who was executed. Farringdon, because he came from the town of Farringdon. The last abbot of Reading, 1520 to 1539, who refusing to surrender the abbey to King Henry VIII and died on the gallows. In te domum sperae. Okay, so go to the Lord in hope. That's what it says. See, I do know a few words in Latin. So having more of a tour around Reading Abbey, and the gateway is right beside the Crown Court. Another thing about the clergy is a sort of outside secular law. Henry II got himself into an awful lot of trouble in trying to get jurisdiction over the clergy, because the Catholic Church, being a sovereign state to this day, the Vatican City said no, you cannot try clergy in courts. So the chapter house, I said they read the chapter of the Bible, but the higher ranking monks who'd been there longer, at least 7 years, were called a senior, and who's been there under 7 years was a junior. They would debate the issues facing the monastery and try to arrive at consensus, and they could penalise monks who thought to have transgressed what the rule of St. Benedict, and the good of all would mandate us to a little strictness, so it says in the rule of St. Benedict. He said he didn't intend to lay down anything burdensome. Well, it does seem extraordinarily burdensome to me. Anyway, is there anything else to say about this? Probably not. Okay. More and more of Reading Abbey. So I wonder if you've have enough of Reading Abbey. My knowledge of it is almost exhausted. So if you want to become a monk, typically it's a process of at least 4 years. Well, first of all, you might go just to visit, stay a weekend, say a few weekends a week. Try it out. Do you like it? Are you suitable? And then if you think you are, then you apply and you go and you're robed on your first day, actually wearing the habit. So you have to wear what they wear for meals and prayers. But if you're doing something else, if you're going jogging, of course you can wear sports clothes. And Benedictines, when they went away from the abbey, today they just wear ordinary clothes like anybody else. Well, they don't have to. They can wear their habit if they want to. What else about trying it out? And then you start your novitiate. You're a novice trying it out. Before, when you're just visiting for a week or so, you're a postulant. You're thinking about it. And then you take simple vows after 2 years, and then you take final vows after a further 2 years. It's about a 4-year process, and then all the other monks meet to discuss your progress. Do they think you're suitable? Do they want you to live with you for the rest of their lives? Because they might say no, and they have to be checked out by a psychiatrist. I'm not joking, because they might be really loopy. I've heard of some who are daft as a brush. So I want to be a monk and I want to get married and have lots of children. Well, you can't do both. They almost hadn't realised they're not compatible. And there is actually a personality disorder called the monkish personality disorder. So you see this huge set of pillars, and this is where the Abbey church was at the time. So there was the choir, which is the bit of the church nearest the altar, and there's a little cage. People weren't allowed beyond that, the laity, because the laity would come in for worship as well as the monks. So and Henry I is buried here, like I said. So and the complex went beyond what we can see now, over the wall over there. It was beyond that, but more of this doesn't exist. Anything else about Reading Abbey? We don't know exactly where Henry I is laid to rest, but I might talk about him a little bit. So there's the transept of the Abbey, which is the bit which goes side to side, because of course it was shaped like a cross, and then the altar is towards the east, is in towards Jerusalem, because where is the sun? Well, the sun must be that way. So I think the altar is down there, if I got that right. Anyway, so it was incredibly expensive to build. It took almost a century to complete. And they had their income from the monastery for various things, partly running a school, partly charging people dues on river transport, the Kennet being navigable, as well as the Thames. So there was a mint here, so coins were struck for the king, for Edward III in particular. The nave is the main part of the church, and the main went forwards, backwards, if I got that right. This is the transept side to side, I think. Yeah. And there was obviously a treasury to keep the wealth there, or the newly minted coins before they go into circulation. Yeah, so chapel east of the south transept. Reading that sign there. Anything else I should know? So I could talk about Henry I. I think I did in a separate video. I'm not sure I can be bothered with it today. So south transept Abbey Church. Because I remember in these monastery schools, it's not called a chapel. It's called an Abbey Church. Ampleforth College, for example, chapel and vestry. Look how high it was. Vestry, as in where they put their robes on, their vestiments. Like vêtements in French. So to divest, to take off the robes, transvestite, like dressing across, cross-dressing, as if you're a man dressing as a woman, or vice versa. So perhaps you got a little bit of an idea. And just up there, you see the window. Some of the windows are open. That is of that old Reading jail, which I mentioned. So the chapel of Reading jail. So Oscar Wilde, he's right beside somewhere so historic, when he was taking a 2-year midlife sabbatical. Well, actually, it was very close to the end of his life. And this is the bit we're in before, which I mentioned, the chapter house. So that is probably enough of Reading Abbey, and there are even more buildings which don't survive at all. So yeah, as I say, probably the houses around here, some of them will have nicked the stone for their foundations, but we won't see that bit because they're covered up and built over. So it survived the ravages of the centuries rather well, I think you might concur. And then there's a little image of what it would have looked like at the time, Reading Abbey. So I don't think I'd be bothered to do Henry I. There it is. Okay, you can see the Abbey Church with the belfry. That's the sort of, or campanile, with the bells in it high up, and they've got those sort of almost windows with slats so the sound can actually get out. And then a courtyard called the cloisters. I'm not quite sure which one's the calefactory, the refectory, the infirmary, the chapter house, and then some sort of perimeter wall. I'm just showing the land beyond, not showing us which direction the river is, unfortunately. So that is a little bit about Reading Abbey. I hope you found it informative. Ooh, it looks, sounds like there's a school in there, hearing little children. Appropriately enough, presumably it's a Catholic school because it was right beside the Catholic Church, because till the 16th century, really all education was provided by the Church. And then, as I said, Henry VIII closed down so many religious houses. That's a term which covers monastery, abbey, priory, convent, chantry, whatever you want to call it, that his son, Edward VI, the godly imp, came to the throne at the age of 9, and he began to fill the vacuum by founding a lot of schools. If there's ever a King Edward school, which King Edward? This country had 8 of them. So there's usually Edward VI, like King Edward School, Birmingham, was founded by him, or Repton or Shrewsbury, or quite a few others. Okay, so that's enough from me in Reading Abbey. This would have been probably maybe a bit of the gardens or something like that of Reading Abbey. The River Kennet is that way, the Thames is that away, in the middle of Reading, Berkshire. Okay, so goodbye everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, found it somewhat informative. If you learned at least one thing today, would you most kindly donate to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Callahan spelled C-A-L-L-A-G-H-A-N, all small letters, because I desperately need donations to keep this going. So book online lessons with me in history, politics, religious studies, French, law, geography. I help people with UCAS statements, with dissertations, essays, theses, their coursework. I translate from French, Spanish, Italian, Russian, German and Romanian. I'm a tour guide in Londinian and around whenever tourism reopens. Okay, toodle pip.